Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Well, hello to all of our listeners. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mike Bohan. I've got our resident safety experts, Jim Seibert and Kenny Ray, in here with me as always. And what a great day we've got here, guys. It's been a busy week for me. I know you guys are busy as well. We're out there on the road. We're visiting clients. And, sometimes you just wake up in the morning and you know it's going to be a good day. And I felt like that this morning when I woke up. That doesn't mean we're not busy. We may not be stressed out, but it just felt like a good day. And I love it when that happens because it doesn't always feel like that. You don't always just roll out of bed feeling good. But I kind of felt like that this morning. And I wanted to ask you guys, because I know in this industry, it's a very busy industry. We've got a lot going on. It can be very stressful, not just for us, but for our clients out there. And I wanted to kind of pick your all's brains a little bit because I really am curious. I want to know I want to know this about you guys, of what you guys do in your personal life to cope with the stress of the job or any stressors you may have. Because my go-tos are, I like physical activity. I like to get outside. I mean, I've got friends that think I'm crazy, but I love mowing the yard. That's a stress reliever for me. I get outside. I love being outside. Sometimes my wife and I'll jump in the truck and we'll just go drive gravel roads. I mean, that's a stress reliever for me. But what do you guys do to cope with that when you're just feeling the stress of life or the stress of a job, on a daily?
I'm going to reveal something to our listeners that they'd probably never, ever know, short of you asking that question. And that's that the two of you, Mike and Jim, are the two best counselors I know that are practicing counseling without a counseling license. And what I mean by that, both of y'all have been the recipients of me calling y'all on the phone while I'm blasting down the highway and I've had some stressful event, and I'll say, listen, I'm not calling about business. I'm not calling about an account. I'm just calling to vent. I'm just calling to talk. And the three of us, in fact, we get on conference calls with all three of us on there. And next thing you know, I've done eat up, 60, 70 miles of highway in an hour, and the three of us are just talking about life. So, one thing I do, I guess in general, is I turn to my buddies, my friends, and I just unload on guys that I know won't be critical of me, won't criticize me, that just love me like I am, and say, well, he's had a rotten day and he just needs to unload on somebody. And that happens to be the two of y'all.
Well, I appreciate that. That makes me feel good, because I know that does help when you can talk stuff out. I mean, that does with just some good buddies, some good friends. You talk some stuff out. Thanks for sharing that. That makes me feel good, man. I'm telling you, I appreciate that. Jim, what about you, man? What's your go-to?
It's tough. I'm just kind of chuckling on the inside here because I'm one of those guys that's got to make the mistake about 20 times in a row when it comes to my relationship with my wife before I get the big picture. And, just telling your wife, well, maybe don't think about it, or you're going to have to get over that. That's never worked, not in the first 20 times of me saying it to her, before I realized that sometimes all I got to do is listen. She's not wanting me to be a problem solver. She just wants me to listen. And that's tough, but I'm getting trained. I'm getting trained to be a good listener. So stress in my life, Mike, I'm an outdoor guy as well. And, but those decompression moments they're tough for me to get right now. Maybe some in my family would argue that it's tough for me to get them, but I do like mowing. I like taking care of my land. I just bought a new chainsaw, so I got some cedar trees to cut down, and I spend more time with kids and ball right now than I've got time to go and do what I feel like my body requires for decompression. However, watching the joy in the kids and watching light bulbs come on in their mind when you're explaining the game and you're there and seeing them grow, that brings joy back into stuff, and just joy and thankfulness. Thanksgiving is a decompression in a sense to me. So when I can smile and I can laugh and I can watch that happen, and we're in my favorite time of year, where trees are blossoming and the wildlife's just exploding, and all of that just brings kind of a heart of thankfulness, which stress can interrupt. But when that happens, I think about all that there is to be thankful for. I get outside, I sweat, I work the land, and I try to spend good time with the family. And that kind of takes the things of the world and the stress of the job and puts it on a back shelf until I got to revisit it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, I appreciate y'all sharing that, because I feel like everybody who's listening to us runs into that same kind of thing. And if you are tuning in to listen to us and you saw the topic for today, we're going to be talking about regulatory audits. And if there's one thing that brings a lot of stress to a trucking company or a safety director, that's a regulatory audit. When the FMCSA or DOT or one of their state partners comes knocking on the door, that's a stressful situation. And, just like anything else in life, some people handle that situation better than others, but I'm telling you, it's a stressful situation. And what we want to do today is kind of go through some of the areas where the FMCSA or the DOT is going to be doing an audit, and give you some tips on how to be successful through that process, and even before that process may happen. Because it's, I remember years ago, Kenny, I know you've done hundreds of audits, if not more, thousands over your career. I remember this one particular gentleman years and years ago. He was a young man, and I went to do an audit with him. And when we finished it up, he just looked at me and said, I was so stressed out. Just the anticipation of this audit, I was so stressed out. He said, my hair started falling out. And I couldn't hardly believe it, but his wife was there. It was a young couple. I looked at his wife, and she just nodded and said, yeah, he's been so stressed out. And that always stuck with me, because I know, that's an extreme level, but it is there. It's that stress, just the anticipation of the audit. So I hated that for him, but as they made it through the audit fine, and we worked together great. But it's just it's something that we want to talk about today, and just give you some tips on how to get through that stuff. So before we do that, I want to just start off by just doing a high level overview, that 30,000 foot view of when audits happen, or the interventions most commonly happen, and then we'll get into those tips on how to prepare for an audit and how to be successful through the process. So, and Kenny, jump in here anytime you want to, because I'm not going to get real detailed on this, but basically when we're looking at an audit, a regulatory audit from the FMCSA, it's going to most commonly be generated by our roadside performance, right? We're going to have either crashes or inspections with violations. That's what's going to be driving a lot of whether or not somebody comes in to do an audit on our company. If our scores are elevated to a certain to a certain level, or the intervention threshold, then we're going to be flagged and get a little more attention from the FMCSA. That's initially going to start with the early contact. They're going to, if you get above the intervention threshold in a basic area, that CSA basic area, you're going to get a warning letter from the FMCSA that talks about the area where you're deficient, and they're going to give you time to self-correct that. You're probably going to see more targeted roadside inspections at scale houses and even the portable scales. So that's something that they're going to do early on. And then if you don't correct and the FMCSA does actually contact you, now we're looking at an investigation that either one of the federal investigators or one of their state partners is going to either do an off-site investigation, an on-site focused, or an on-site comprehensive. And these are things that the types of investigations years ago, we used to call them compliance reviews, and now we're just calling them investigations. These are the types of investigations that you would come through and have either a non-rated or a satisfactory conditional or unsatisfactory safety rating from those. The other type that a lot of carriers that are in business now have seen is the new entrant safety audit process. That's an audit that you can go through that's that's a little bit different than the investigations. But anybody who gets a US DOT number and they're operating as a new company, sometime within that first 12 months, they're going to come out and do a new entrance safety audit. And they kind of say this is more educational in nature, but they're still going to have regulatory requirements that you are required to meet, and it's pass fail. And those are the most common types. I know there's hazmat investigations they can do and other things, but it's really those offsite, on-site focused investigations, and then on-site comprehensive investigations. And Kenny, I don't know if you want to jump in there and talk about kind of what you've done throughout your career, and then what you see now when you're helping your clients go through when they get called as on an audit.
Well, I think the descriptions you gave were fantastic. The new entrant audit is, I always tell people there's really no spanking involved with that, as long as you're trying, because they're trying to help these new motor carriers are getting new DOT numbers to get off to a good start. But I think the focus, what we want to talk about today, is really the compliance reviews, or the regulatory audits, where, like you said, you either have bad roadside inspection performance, or heaven forbid, you've been involved in a fatality wreck. That normally will rocket you to the top of the list. All of the troopers now nationwide have the ability, when they're doing a roadside inspection, to do what's commonly called a law enforcement referral, where they basically check a box. It doesn't show up, it doesn't print on your copy of the roadside inspection, but it sends a note back to their state headquarters: this motor carrier needs to be looked at. And then one other way is if a disgruntled employee leaves and goes to the trouble of filing a whistleblower complaint with FMCSA, that'll oftentimes bring them in as well. But what we really want to talk about today is, they're coming. FMCSA is coming, or I'm in Texas. It could be Texas DPS, it could be Missouri Department of Transportation, it could be the Oklahoma Highway Patrol. But they're coming, and they're going to do an audit, and they normally give you 72-hour notice, and they're still doing a lot of them remotely. So they'll send you an email, and the very first thing, they normally ask for a driver list. They want an equipment list. They'll have a questionnaire they want you to fill out, and they'll ask you to send you their accident register. One thing I encourage people to do, Mike, most of our motor carriers are somewhat familiar with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, but there's one part, and y'all remember, parts are what the FMCSA calls chapters of the book, if you will. But Part 385 is the audit rules, and very few people ever look in that. It tells you what's going to happen during an audit. It tells you how an audit is scored. It tells you, you mentioned about the satisfactory, conditional, unsatisfactory. It tells you how an auditor gets to that kind of safety rating. It gives you the list of acute and critical violations that you're going to accumulate points on an audit. So if you're getting an audit, I would encourage you to get over into Part 385 and at least familiarize yourself. You'll at least be a little more conversant with the auditor whenever he or she shows up. And Mike, you and I have done so many of them, both regulatory audits and mock audits, that, can we just walk through and tell folks some of the main things we see? Because I think it's the easiest way for them to get prepared. One thing I want to say, if nobody remembers anything else that Kenny Ray says today on this particular podcast, the number one way I think that you can get ready for a real audit is to have a mock audit. And have somebody come in that knows what they're doing. And I'm not trying to blow mine and Mike's horn, but we both were auditors. I was an auditor with the Texas Department of Public Safety, and Mike was an auditor with Missouri Department of Transportation. We've done regulatory audits where there were consequences associated with them. And so get somebody to come in that understands the audit process, knows how it works, knows how to do the sampling matrix on picking the number of drivers and the number of trucks and which one you're going to pick and what they're going to look at. And, reach out to your insurance folks. And if you're one of our clients, we offer that service to you. If you're with somebody else, and we don't try to sell insurance on this podcast, but reach out to your insurance folks and say, hey, I was listening to this podcast. Do y'all do mock audits? I want one, and let them come in and talk to them. But basically, the audit's going to walk through. It's going to look at your insurance, whether or not you got the right filing. And we're seeing a huge problem with this right now because a lot of motor carriers that don't consider themselves hazmat carriers are starting to dabble in hazmat, particularly Class 9 miscellaneous, which doesn't require placards, and they find they don't have enough insurance on file with FMCSA. They're going to look at your accident register going back 3 years. Drivers you have on that are going to probably be ones they're going to start looking at DQ files. On your driver qualification files, they're going to select certain ones. I've never known an auditor that just completely leaves it up to the motor carrier, says, hey, I need 10 files, go pick me 10.
Right.
They're going to look at guys or gals, your drivers that are on your accident register. They're going to look at ones that have had positive drug and alcohol tests. They're going to look at ones that have had hours of service violations. They're going to look at ones that have had bad roadside inspections. But they'll tell you the number of files, and then they're going to, the auditor ought to explain to you how they get to the 10 or 12 or 15, however many they need, the specific ones they ask for. I would also encourage, because hours of service is very important on an audit, because if you get audit points on hours of service, by definition, out of Part 385, those points automatically double. And so if they find patterns of violations on critical violations in hours of service and you pick up points, you're going to get double points on hours of service. So I would encourage you, there's 3 reports I think everybody ought to run regularly. One's a violation summary through your ELD system. The other one's unassigned driving events and a disconnect or odometer jump skip report. If you're using personal conveyance, you need to run a report and see how your drivers are using PC, because that is an area that people are getting popped on pretty regularly. If you're using the short haul exception, make sure your time records are up to date. Drug and alcohol, you got to have absolutely a written policy. The 2 areas I see most often that are missing on that, and again, you can get into Part 382, there's 12 items that have to be in your drug and alcohol policy. And the 2 I see missing most are the actual description of the drugs and their effect on the human body. I see a lot of that missing sometimes. And a lot of the drug and alcohol policies have not been updated since we've gone to the clearinghouse. And I'm finding some that just don't even mention the clearinghouse at all. And it's one of the 12 items that have to be in there. Make sure you have training certificates on your supervisors for reasonable suspicion. When you start getting into maintenance files, and Jim, you can talk anything you want to share about maintenance files. But
Kenny, before you get to that, the maintenance files, while you're on that 382 part, one thing I would point out, and it doesn't matter what kind of audit that they're doing, whether it's an offsite focused or an offsite or an onsite focused or an onsite comprehensive, they're going to look at Part 382. That's something they're always going to look at. They're going to want to make sure that you're testing the proper percentage rates on your randoms. You got all your pre-employments the way they should be, that you're doing the clearinghouse. That's something they're going to look at every time. So that's a good point you're bringing up, because it doesn't matter if they come in and do a focused investigation on hours of service, they're still going to look at 382. They're still going to look at that drug and alcohol testing information.
And I see, Mike, a lot of our, particularly smaller clients, that they're having trouble getting their semi-annual report from their consortium, which the consortium is required by law to give them. They have to provide it to them. And the auditor is always going to ask for that, because it shows your testing rate. It shows any positives you've had. And again, if you've got a driver that shows up, normally a pre-employment's not such a big deal because you didn't hire that guy. But if you have somebody that tests positive on a random or a post-accident, man, they're going to want to see the DQ file on that guy. So,
Absolutely.
you got to get that semi-annual report from your consortium to even know who the people are. 2 other things I'll say, and then I'm going to yield it to you and Jim to add y'all's comments. But they're going to calculate your accident rate, which is your number of DOT crashes times 1 million miles divided by your actual mileage over a 12-month period. If that number is above a 1.5, you're going to get the best you can get is a conditional rating on factor 6 on the audit, and that's just going to clobber you. So if your accident rate's high, you either got to increase your mileage or decrease your number of crashes. And then the other thing is, and you can get this out of SAFER, but your out of service rate on maintenance has got to be below 34%, or you're going to get a conditional safety rating on factor number 4. And the last thing, and I'll stop with this because y'all know I'm an old hazmat guy, but if they do a hazmat audit, the number 1 area that companies are getting popped on hazmat on audits is not having training. either not doing training at all or not having training records. And that is a huge, huge issue in the hazmat world, is not documenting your hazmat training.
Well, three things you said that I had notes, kind of jotted them down again here. So I just remember to follow back around on these things. If you're going through an audit, three of the quickest ways you could probably get a conditional rating or a less than satisfactory rating. Kenny, you mentioned them all. One is your accident rate. The other one's your out of service rate. And then the other one is if you've got a pattern of critical violations in your hours of service basic, as Kenny mentioned, those are weighted heavier than other types of violations, and it's going to automatically kick you to a conditional if there's a pattern and it shows a critical violation. So those are areas, not that we don't want to, concern ourselves with all the other areas we're talking about, but those are three areas that can get you to conditional really quick. So, you mentioned a little bit about the maintenance, Jim. I don't know if you've got some stuff to add there. I mean, that's another really important part for us, keeping the trucks in good operating condition and keeping track of the maintenance. So.
Yeah, you guys are rich in information. I feel like everything you just shared is like a free pot of gold for listeners. The term document it or it didn't happen, that covers a long list of industries and different business practices. And, talking about maintenance and training, that document, I ran into a situation the other day where someone provided the documentation, and when asked what the training was over, they couldn't recall. When I asked the employee how the training went and what key takeaways were, the employee responded, well, we take care of the paper side to cover down on it, and we just get to it when it's time, or we get to it when we can. And so I said, so this document that says you did the training, you have not conducted the training yet. He goes, no, but we will. And so I go back to the supervisor and I say, training hasn't happened. So we have what I call a pencil whipped document that did not take place. And he affirmed it. And so the document or it didn't happen is the proof that something did happen. It's completed after the fact or in preparation of the fact, and a date's applied once it's been completed. It's not we're going to have our paperwork in order and say we're doing something, but not doing it. That is applicable in the maintenance arena. That's applicable in training. And it is a self-assessment, a pre-audit to the mock audit on these program reviews, our paperwork in order. That is you auditing yourself in preparation for this external consultant to come in and provide you that mock audit for an audit that may or may not happen. But you're working that program, you're drilling that program, and paperwork should match the action, not paperwork manifesting an action that's yet to take place.
Absolutely. And as you were talking there, it reminded me of a lot when you go in and do audits, or you do a mock audit, or a company's doing a self audit. In the maintenance world, a lot of times what you'll see is on the driver vehicle inspection reports. There's rarely anything listed on those where there was a defect on the truck. The drivers just don't tend to list things on those reports like they're required to, whether they either found it or they were made aware of it, something like that. And it's typically not that things aren't getting fixed. It's just they're not getting documented. It's just not getting documented when they do their pre-trip or they do their DVIR. And one of the things that auditors are going to look at is, okay, well, let's look at, let's say, for example, I look at a roadside inspection and there's a truck that was written a violation for tread depth less than 2/32 tread. Well, I'm going to go look at the DVR for that day, and I'm going to go look at the maintenance file for that truck to see if there's documentation that it was noted and that it was fixed and repaired in a proper manner, that kind of stuff. And a lot of times that stuff falls through the cracks. So it's one of those areas that you really have to look at and say, if a driver, and correct me if I'm wrong, Kenny, if I get the wording right, if a driver discovers or is made aware of a violation on a vehicle or a defect on a vehicle, they're required to note that on their DVIR. So if they get a roadside inspection and they get written a violation on that truck, then they'd be required to note that on their DVIR, and it rarely happens. And then sometimes it kind of falls through the cracks, getting back to the mechanics and getting it fixed like it should. Like I said, a lot of times companies are doing the maintenance, they're getting the truck fixed. It's just not documented like it should be. So there's a process you go through there, but just know when an auditor is looking through your maintenance records, they've got data from those roadside inspections. It's just like Kenny was talking about the drivers before. It's not like they're just picking drivers out of a hat, or they're going to let the motor carrier pick the drivers. They kind of know what they want to look at before they get there, because they've got all the data from the roadside inspections. So
on the DVIRs, and you and I we're talking about acute and critical violations under hours of service, but of all things, DVIRs are a critical violation under Part 396. And so if the auditor finds a pattern, and again, a pattern is 10% or more of the documents they look at. So if you're not doing any post-trip inspection reports at all, DVIRs, it's going to be very easy for them to find a pattern. And the next thing you know, you've picked up points, which picking up one point in any of the factors is going to make that factor conditional. And so DVIRs, a lot of people think, well, that's a piddly little thing, and the ELDs have really changed it now, because all the drivers got to do is check a field, says no, no violations found. But on an audit, a DVIR can be a massive, massive issue for a motor carrier. And one other thing you brought up, y'all were talking about records. I see, on the annual DOT inspection, which for us in Texas is our state inspection, but the annual DOT's got a 14-month file retention. Almost every document in an audit's got a different kind of file retention. We got 6 months on hours of service. We got 90 days on DVIRs. We got 1 year on maintenance records. We got 14 months on annual DOT. And about the only way you can comply with that 14-month is to have the current one and the previous one. It's the only way you can keep up with 14 months of a document that only covers 12 months of an inspection period. And I see so many people that are purging they get their brand new DOT, annual DOT, and they throw the old one away. Well, now you don't have 14-month file retention. And you may think, well, that's a piddly little thing. But you and I, coming out of the audit world, auditors note piddly little old things on audit.
That's right.
That's, to an auditor, you would think they found the second shooter on the grassy knoll in 63.
That's right.
It's crazy, some of the stuff that shows up on audit. And one other thing, and Jim was talking about documentation on maintenance files, that if you have your own mechanics and you're doing in-house inspections, or you got people working on brakes, you've got to have training certificates on your mechanics. You have to prove up their credentials, if you will, to the auditor. So great comments Jim made about the documentation. And that's the one area in maintenance where I see motor carriers getting popped. It's like you said, it's not that they're not doing the work, they're not documenting the work. And from an auditor standpoint, that means it didn't happen.
That's right. Yeah. You guys have both said it, and Jim said it earlier. It's like, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that's what I see most often is, it's not that, if you went out in the yard and looked at that truck that you saw that was written for, a slick tire, it's not that they didn't put a new tire on it, but where's the record of it? They're still going to write them a violation during an audit if there was no documentation, even if it was fixed. So, and one thing Jim mentioned when he was talking about the maintenance stuff, which I love, was that pre-audit kind of mindset of, hey, let's get ahead of this, because we're talking about things that they're going to look at during an audit, things that you should know to be successful during an audit, things like that. But I also would encourage everybody to have the mindset of, we're going to get way ahead of this in a couple of ways. We're going to do self-audits. Kenny mentioned, reach out to your insurance company to have mock audits done. Don't ever be afraid to reach out and get some help, because it's way better to do a mock audit with Kenny Ray or Mike Bohan or Jim Seibert sitting in your office than it is, and find things wrong, find where your gaps are at, because a lot of times then if we do a mock audit, we get done, we may find some things. We sit down with the owner and we sit down with the safety director. We're going to go through that stuff. And then that's the end of it. That information is for you. That information is for your company to close the gaps and to get better. And it's way better to do it that way than it is to not know and then end up in an audit and it turn out with some negative ratings or something like that. It's a much better process to go through. So I love the idea of, hey, we're going to do, because a lot of times when I'm talking to our clients, yes, I'll come in and do an audit, but then I'm going to go through this type of information when we're doing the audit. I'm going to say, okay, you guys do go through a self-audit process. And then I may say, I'll come back in 12 months and we'll do another audit, but there should be a self-audit process for them to keep them out of, keep them out of trouble a little bit themselves. So I love that. A couple other things I would say. One is know the regulations. And I know that's tough because we got some thick books with a lot of regulations in them, and I get it. That's another area where, for us and our clients, if you've got questions, you got comments, concerns about what's going on, reach out to us, but know the regulations. So if you've got a safety director, or you are a safety director, or you feel like this is an area where you may be lacking, there's lots of training opportunities out there for those folks. So I would recommend if they need a little more training, or you feel like you are the safety director and you want some more training, there's lots of areas out there. And I know Kenny and I both do a lot of training all over the place that's regulatory training, just like this. And I feel like that's a benefit. And I think it's overlooked a lot of times with companies. It's really digging into the book and understanding what the regulations are. We talked about the mock audits. We talked about the self audits. Those are all things I think are important. And again, just don't be afraid to reach out for help, to pick up the phone and call. It's not, I think a lot of times when it comes to the mock audits, companies, it's almost like they're embarrassed. They don't want somebody in there looking at their stuff because they might be out of compliance. Well, to me, that's the whole part. It's like, we don't, in a mock audit, we don't care what it looks like. Our goal is to get you in compliance and to help you be safe and successful. And the information is for you. It's not like we're going to go out and share that with anybody else. So I highly recommend that. I know we've talked about that quite a bit, but I think that's a great process to go through, regardless of who you have come out and do it. So, Kenny, any other points you've got for our listeners here on DOT audits or the regulatory audits that they might need to know?
I do want to share one other thing, Mike. Let's say they get a regulatory audit, and y'all know I'm a country boy. I use country terms. Let's say they get a spanking, and their safety rating gets downgraded. They may go to conditional. Heaven forbid, they may go to unsat. What's going to happen after that is they're going to get notification from FMCSA or the state agency that did it, and it's going to have their proposed safety rating in it, and it's going to tell them they have some options. If they get a conditional, it'll tell them that they can request an upgrade back to satisfactory, and they will need to submit a plan. They call it now a safety management plan. We used to call them corrective action plan. Mm-hmm. But if they get an unsat, that corrective action plan or that safety management plan is mandatory, because if they get an unsatisfactory and they don't respond to it, FMCSA is going to pull their DOT number. They're going to be put out of business. And they give them different time frames. So I've seen some of them as short as 45 days. I've seen some of them 60 days. But I guess the thing I want our listeners to know is, just like we're talking about you getting some help on the front end in terms of doing a mock audit, if you get a regulatory audit and your safety rating gets downgraded, if your safety staff is not comfortable drafting and fine-tuning that safety management plan, you need to get somebody in there that's comfortable with that. Mike and I have done a ton of these, and we help our clients with them. Those things have to be written in a certain way. There's certain things FMCSA wants to see in those plans. And y'all know we have regional service centers within FMCSA, and depending on what state you're in, depends on where you have to send yours. Some of the regional service centers want the physical paper documents. So you may have to send hours of service records. You may have to send corrected files. Other ones want you to convert those documents to PDFs and upload them to a website. So get somebody on board that can help you, number one, draft the corrective action plan or the safety management plan, and somebody that understands the FMCSA process of how that's going to be sent in, how it's going to be reviewed, because ultimately what you're asking the federal government to do is they've come in, they've spanked you, they've lowered your safety rating, and you are coming to them with your hat in your hand and saying, we fixed the things you found. Would you raise our safety rating back up? Would you reinstitute our safety rating? And you need somebody helping you with that process, because that affects your business. That affects your ability to stay in business. So it's very important, if you get an audit, what you do on the tail end of it as well.
Yeah. And there was, I think it was the end of last year, I was working with a company. It was in another state from where I'm at, and they went through this process, and the audit process took forever. It was a very, very long audit, and they came out with an adverse rating, and that process was really quick. But just like you said, Kenny, they had 60 days. Yeah, they give them 60 days because they were a non-hazmat carrier. The hazmat folks, if they're placardable amounts hazmat, they're going to be that 45-day mark. Or, we don't deal with a ton of passenger carriers, but the passenger carriers would be a similar situation. But they had 60 days. Well, if you get that letter, or you get through this process and you let that set, and it goes beyond that 60 days and it doesn't get submitted, Kenny's right. I mean, then you're shut down. You have no ability to operate because they're going to pull your authority. Another example I would give, had a company in Missouri here that I worked with. They had a conditional rating for like 10 years and just never did anything with it. Well, we're in the insurance world. I know we're safety guys, but we live in the insurance world. A conditional rating really affects a lot of different things. And one of the things it affects is how much you pay for your insurance.
You bet.
So I talked to this owner of this company, and I said, hey, why don't we take a look at this and request an upgrade? So we went in, printed out a bunch of hours of service records because they went conditional for hours of service. And this was literally a 10-year window. It would amaze me that he sat on it that long, and sent it in. They accepted the upgrade here in Missouri. And of course, they sent it over in Madison, Illinois. But it was a really easy process that didn't take us very long to do. And I wish I could have got to him sooner, but it was just one of those things we fixed. And it wasn't as the immediate result of an audit. It was the result of an audit in the past. But don't ever think, oh, I got a conditional rating, I'm just stuck with it. There's a way to get those upgraded. You just got to show improvement. So that's great info there, Kenny. Appreciate that. A lot of things we discussed today, and I wish we had more time to get a little more in depth on some of the areas like the factors and how the rating process works, but we just simply don't have the time to do that. But if you have any questions about the audit process or how the ratings work or any of the things we discussed today, what a critical violation is, what an acute violation is, any of the things we discussed, please reach out to your risk consultant. We'd be glad to visit with you about that, because there's a lot of information there. I mean, there's a lot of regulations we have to comply with, but there's also a lot of steps that you have to go through in the audit process that we'd be glad to visit with you about. So don't ever hesitate to reach out. So to our listeners, thanks for sticking with us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. For my co-hosts, Kenny Ray and Jim Seibert, I'm Mike Bohan. We're glad you were with us today, and thanks for joining us on Driving the Line, the podcast that is always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.